Co-hosts of today's program are the ACLU of New Hampshire Peace Action, NAACP Manchester, UU Action, Showing Up for Racial Justice in Concord, New Hampshire Council of Churches, and the Martin Luther King Coalition are our co-hosts for today. We will show a film that will be 30 minutes. Feel free to add thoughts or questions into the chat during the film. But while the film is on, we would like you to please have yourself on mute. So if you can mute yourself for the showing of the film, and then the panelists will unmute. Ed Taylor, who's a board member and a member of ACLU New Hampshire, is unable to be with us, and Arnie Alpert is graciously agreed to moderate the discussion. During the discussion, please put your questions into the chat, and we will take questions or ask you to unmute to have your question. I am going to give you a warning that the film does have some violent images. So there is violence. We are recording tonight's program. And after, we will end the program with an action that we will ask you all to do. And we'll put that in the chat. If you are having troubles viewing the video through the Zoom link, we will share a YouTube link of the video. If you find it easier to watch it yourself, like exit Zoom, watch it yourself, and come back to the Zoom link for the discussion at 7:30. Without further ado, we'll start the film. Brian.
Nobody could vote because they would put up all kind of hindrances.
This courthouse does not belong to Sheriff Clark. This courthouse belongs to the people of Dallas County.
You came down to make a mockery out of this courthouse.
If you were white, you were right. If you were black, you get back.
I don't think we went too far arresting them. We didn't beat them. We didn't hurt them.
I would rather die on the highways of Alabama than conscience. You are ordered to disperse.
My heart was beating faster and faster because I
am so scared. Because the violence.
But I remember most of the screams.
Coming down on the heads of women and children and splitting them like watermelons.
I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. I thought I was going to die.
And we shall overcome.
And now we have this possibility of the right to participate in the political process.
There's always been an organized attempt to turn the clock back.
Selma helped change not just America, but the world.
Selma, Alabama was like so many towns in the racially segregated South. But for a few months in 1965, it became the epicenter for a movement that forced the nation to look at itself, its prejudices, racial divides, inequalities, and its brutality. In so many ways, Selma was the perfect place for a march to remember. Selma's Queen of Peace Catholic Church was created in 1970. There were two churches, one all black, the other all white.
I'm very proud of being the pastor right now of one of the only integrated churches in Dallas County.
Father, a Catholic order that came to Selma in the 1930s to serve its African population.
And it was at a time in which segregation was strong.
Color was to be the badge of how you would be treated. White, you were right. If you were black, you get back.
I, as a child, saw, even from my own house, the fear that my parents had.
It's hard to describe because I didn't know anything else.
Feeling the disrespect, that they had to face every day.
And our parents sort of kept us sheltered from the bad stuff. If we needed shoes, they'd measure our feet with string and then go downtown and bring us back the shoes. You didn't always like what they brought back, but you had shoes.
I used to see the for colored signs only, the for white signs only, and I used to ask questions about it. And many times my parents didn't even want to respond to my questions.
As far as economic condition, we had outdoor bathrooms, and we were very poor. Life was a struggle.
Henry Allen was in high school. Joanne Bland was 11 years old.
And I wanted to sit at that lunch counter. But my grandmother said that because my grandmother was talking to one of her friends in front of the store. In the window, and she leaned over and she said, when we got free, we can do that too. And she pointed at the counter.
It had been a decade since the Supreme Court integrated schools. 5 years since lunch counter sit-ins. 4 years since freedom riders came to Alabama and Mississippi on interstate buses. And only months since Freedom Summer in Mississippi and the slaying of 3 civil rights workers in nearby Neshoba County. Now the glacial pace of civil rights turned to voting rights.
Nobody could vote because they would put up all kind of hindrances. If you pass one, they'd come up with another one. You'd have to answer questions about anything to keep you, and then they tell you you failed.
Before 1965, less than 2% of blacks, only 240, could vote. In neighboring Lowndes County, where the black population was 5,000, not one was registered to vote.
How many amendments are there to the Alabama Constitution? You know, after this November, there's 861. That's a lot of material. What's amendment number 275 of the Alabama Constitution?
And then you wait in line to go in to see the person who was doing the registering. And sometimes you will wait in line for several hours. And if you got in to see the registrar, they might tell you that you're the last person to come in and you only had a few minutes because the registrar had to go home.
Then you go back to work and you find out you're fired.
And in a strange sense, in a strange way, Selma selected herself. Black men and women stood in unmovable line, sometime all day. There were black school teachers in this city were told they could not read or write well enough, that they failed the so-called literacy test.
Georgia Congressman John Lewis was among the early organizers with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, called SNCC. The group joined voter registration efforts already underway in Selma.
Well, when I first went to Selma, Alabama, there was an X on the map for Selma. In other words, 2 other teams of SNCC workers had gone down to Selma and had come back with the because it was too dangerous, and white people were too mean, black folks were too afraid.
But we had a long line of persons. When one was denied, the other one stepped up until the voting rights registration time ended. And so that particular day, and we came back the next time to pursue this whole questions of people having the right to vote regardless of the color of their skin.
Standing in the way of blacks who wanted to register to vote was Dallas County Sheriff Jim Clark, who bullied and beat demonstrators on the courthouse steps.
He's carrying out the orders of the white community to keep minorities, blacks, from becoming registered.
This man was very cruel. He was vicious. Who wore a gun on one side, a nightstick on the other side, and he carried an electric cap router in his hand. He didn't use it on cows. He wore a button on his left lapel that said never.
This courthouse does not belong to Sheriff Clark. This courthouse belongs to the people of Dallas County, and these are the people of Dallas County, and they have come to register.
The key to the whole movement was student nonviolent. He meant they slapped you on the right cheek, you turned the left cheek. And so when they recruited me, then I went out and started recruiting. So we recruited this whole entire school from the 12th grade through the 7th grade.
It came down to make a this house, and we're not going to have it.
Students, teachers, dignified demonstrations.
most of the middle class. They were utterly dependent on white school officials for their jobs. Mostly older people, all dressed up, walking very quietly down the sidewalk, not getting in the way of anything. They went to the courthouse. Clark manhandled them on the steps of the courthouse, didn't arrest anybody, but then they turned, okay, you're not letting us in, we're keeping our dignity. Reese turned around and they walked back. I'm in the church when they start coming in.
Well, I get punched with his billy club and so forth, but there again we were determined that we were not going to allow billy clubs and anything else to stop us from pursuing the rights that we felt that all persons had, the right to participate in the political process.
People were crying. This was some kind of breakthrough. I'm talking grizzled, hardened veteran civil rights workers as well as students. Oh my gosh, these folks have broken their chains enough to actually go out and do this. They are real live role models for us today, and we needed it so bad.
It was dangerous work, even for who was attacked with friends as he walked home from a church mass meeting.
When I got middle way, there were 3 state troopers horseback hiding between the buildings. They ran everybody off the porches. They ran everybody in the house. They beat people in the community. I started running down the sidewalk, and only God, no way I could outrun 3 horses. They had the cow pearl in one hand. They were swinging at me with the billy club in the other hand. And one elderly lady to my left took the feet, running so fast like a diving boat. I dove through her door with both my hands, and I came this close today of being killed. And then my mind started really thinking and focusing in. I laid on the floor crying. I said, Lord, what must I do? Should I quit? Or should I continue? Because I lived a mile away from there. I had to go back through another day to even get home. And so my mind said, okay, not gonna quit.
The marches to the courthouse continued. Adults and children were arrested and jailed, including 20-year-old Linda Blackman Lowry.
Friends, if we came from different schools, it was like this Three Musketeers atmosphere, one for all and all for one, because we were all scared. If one cried, somebody else would cry too. You know, if one started singing, we'd all start singing.
We love sweet child.
It was just, we had each other's back.
My mother had to go down to the courthouse to visit Judge Bernard Realm. Mother came in, I was standing silent. He said, today I'm gonna let your nigger children out of jail. And I better not ever catch these children or the Brown Chapel Church marching again. Oh, my mother done with tears in her eyes, and she was saying, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. I was inside, I was angry. I was a teenager, but I knew that anything I said or done was wrong.
40 years later, while he was living in a nursing home, former Sheriff Jim Clark was asked about the arrest.
A lot of times we had to do what we had to do. You talk about school kids, for instance. I don't think we went too far arresting them. We didn't beat them. We didn't hurt them.
After having gone through many difficulties prior to that time, as SNCC was in here, we decided that we would invite Dr. King. And so I signed the official invitation, inviting Dr. King and the members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to come here to Selma.
I was tired. I'd been through, Albany, Birmingham, St. Augustine, Savannah, and the March on Washington, and and I was ready to, cool it for the winter.
Andrew Young, former Atlanta mayor and UN ambassador, was a close advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They were coming off 2 hectic years.
I have a dream.
With the 1963 March on Washington, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and now voter rights, and Selma became their focus.
Fireworks started almost immediately. We went to try to check in a hotel, and while they were trying to check in the hotel, this guy came up and tapped Martin on the shoulder, and nobody paid any attention to him. He said, bam! And Martin, you know, he hit him pretty hard. And he rubbed his head. He said, no, he said, don't bother him. He said, you have a problem with me, sir? Can I help you? And everybody wanted to tear him to pieces. He said, no, please, let's hear what he has to say. And by that time, Wilson Baker, who was the chief of police, had come up and taken him away.
Believe it or not, there was an injunction against public gatherings of more than 3 people in Selma. And so when Dr. King came that morning, January 2nd, 1965, they were driving into a situation where they were going to be challenging an existing injunction.
When Dr. King came and when Dr. King spoke, it just put fire in your bones. It's something about Dr. King that no man ever spoke like Dr. King. No man could motivate you like Dr. King could.
The Selma meetings and protests led to thousands of arrests, including Dr. King and Chuck Fager.
And the trustee brought one plate of greens for Dr. King, and nobody in the room, nobody would eat it. He and Abernathy always fasted first couple of days they were in jail, and I didn't know that, so I wasn't planning to, so I got to eat it.
While sitting in a Selma jail cell, Dr. King wrote a letter that was published in the New York Times that read, "This is Selma, Alabama. There are more Negroes in jail with me than there are on the voting rolls."
He knew that every day could be his last. And so he couldn't let up. And he always said, look, you're gonna die. Everybody's gonna die. And you don't have anything to say about when you die. You don't have anything to say about how you die. The only thing you can decide is what is it you give your life for.
When Lyndon Johnson was elected president in a November 1964 landslide, one of the people he called to thank was Martin Luther King.
How they justify their faith and how many more now we've got to help get out of their bondage.
Yes, well, we are certainly all very happy about the outcome. It was just such a great victory.
And just 2 weeks after King's arrival in Selma, the two were on the phone again, with the president explaining his strategy for fast-tracking Medicare, education, and anti-poverty legislation, and his interest in voters' rights.
Now, if we can get that, and we can get a Medicare, we ought to get that by February. Then we get our poverty. That will be more than double what it was last year. Then we've got to come up with the qualification of voters. That will answer 70% of your problems. That's right. If you can find the worst condition that you run into in Alabama, Mississippi, or Louisiana, or South Carolina, where, well, I think one of the worst I ever heard of is the president of the school at Tuskegee, or the head of the government department there, or something, being denied the right to cast a vote. And if you just take that one illustration and get it on radio and get it on television and get it on in the pulpits, get it in the meetings, get it every place you can, pretty soon the fellow that didn't do anything but drive a tractor, he'll say, well, that's not right, that's not fair.
But the voters' rights movement was about to take a turn that would be even more shocking and would push the president and Congress to act.
James was the one that Dr. King was seeing to go to these places and, I guess, case the place out, see what it's about, find churches where they can have mass meetings.
Marion Easley's older brother, James Orange, had been sent to Marion, a small town 30 miles north of Selma.
They say he had too much power, too much control over the young people. And then they say that the people that was with him were too young. So they put him in jail. He was arrested. It was an older guy that they let out of jail. He heard them say that they was gonna lynch him. To throw them off, they start marching that night. And the state troopers and the policemen shot the lights out in the city, in the little town. So that meant that they couldn't see.
Police attacked and beat the marchers. 24-year-old Jimmy Lee Jackson sought refuge with his mother and grandfather inside a cafe.
And we heard so much noise and what have you. That's when my friends and I, we all came down. And
Jimmy had gotten shot, and numerous of people had been like beaten and what have you. And so we began trying to get people to the hospitals and what have you. Jimmy was first carried to the Perry County Hospital, but he was denied. And as a result, he was carried to Good Sand Hospital in Selma.
And so you're waiting to see, you know, how's he doing? So there's tension and suspense building there. And then he gets all infected inside and suddenly he dies. And then you're mad.
Oh, man of angels coming after me.
Today, a granite memorial on Jimmy Lee Jackson's grave has been scarred by bullets. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders led the funeral procession to this small cemetery outside Marion.
Only for to carry me home.
All of us were mad at Jimmy Lee Jackson being killed for nothing. I think on that march, the idea of going to Montgomery was born.
Without his death, the movement wouldn't have gotten very far off the ground.
And with that march to Montgomery came Bloody Sunday. A nation is shocked when Selma, a march to remember, continues.
We get to the highest point on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, crossing the Alabama River. Down below, we saw a sea of blue, Alabama State Troopers.
My heart was beating faster and faster because I knew something was going to happen.
You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church. This march will not continue.
When Jose Williams said to Major Cloud, give us a moment to kneel and pray. The major said, troopers advance. You saw this man and others putting on their gas masks. And Jose Williams said to me, John, they're going to gas us.
And then we were asked to turn around, and the leaders at the front of the line refused. And after they refused, racism unleashed its brutality upon us.
They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks, pushing and shoving us, and then tramping us with horses. They released tear gas.
But I remember most of the screams. People were screaming and screaming, and people were just laying everywhere like they were dead, bleeding and not moving, and you couldn't stop to help them.
People had begun to be beaten down with billy clubs. Dogs and horses had begun to push their way into the crowd. Tear gas had begun to burst in the air. People had begun to try to run for their lives.
Once that tear gas hits you, you don't have any sense of direction.
I saw a horse just run over a lady. The man hit her, I don't know, but I could still hear the sound her head made when it hit that pavement.
Not only were my eyes hurting, my ears were hurting. And I saw grown men on horseback with billy clubs the size of baseball bats, coming down on the heads of women and children and splitting them like watermelons.
I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. My legs went from under me. I thought I was going to die.
And the late Reverend Hosea Williams picked me up, and my little feet were still galloping in his arms. And I looked at him, very frightened, devastated, and I said to him, put me down, because you are not running fast enough.
Some of us will run out of the line because Jim Clark and his deputies, after beating us, pursued us. And we had to go all the way back to Brown Chapel Church.
The people came back to the church and they're hysterical. People are talking about going home, getting their guns. And so go up on the steps. I go up, and a couple of others were up on the steps of the church, and we were saying to people, please go into the church. Don't stand out here. There's troopers and possemen out there. They got guns. They're crazy. This is dangerous. No, don't go home and get your guns. That's just going to give them an excuse.
We had turned the house next to Brown Chapel into a clinic. And the people who were bleeding or who need stitches or or had been seriously hurt were sort of laid out over there.
And I do recall being back at the church, and someone asked me to say something, and I stood up and said, I don't understand it, how President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam and cannot send troops to Selma, Alabama to protect people who only desires to register to vote.
Less than a week after protesters turned around at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, President Johnson addressed a joint session of Congress, formally proposing what would become the Voting Rights Act.
There is no moral issue. It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country. And we shall overcome.
Just as I have a dream.
There's always been an organized attempt to turn the clock back.
The 1965 Voting Rights Act placed extra restrictions on Southern states. They had to get pre-approval from the U.S. Department of Justice for any changes in local voting rules or districts.
And there were 9 states that were totally covered, and an additional 7 states that were partially covered, and some 12,000 cities and counties.
In the city of Calera, Alabama, the 2010 census showed the population tripled during the previous decade. The city's only black councilman had his district redrawn.
Several communities was added to my district, and it changed the district completely from a 70% African-American majority district down to about a 29% district.
Ernest Montgomery lost the next election, but the Justice Department voided the results, redrew the lines, and called for a new election.
We won our seat back, and here we are.
But that led to a pivotal court challenge from Shelby County.
Obviously, in 1965, the circumstances justified the Voting Rights Act. Now, I can't tell you whether that stopped in 20 years, or 40 years, or 50 years. But at some point along that continuum that brought us up to the time the court considered this in 2013, that was no longer relevant.
In 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed and struck down the pre-clearance provision that affected thousands of Southern communities.
What the court said was that if you were going to impose different treatment on one sovereign state over another, you've got to show the exceptional circumstances. And you can't show the exceptional circumstances as they existed 50 years ago. You've got to show where it exists today.
Most people say, well, no, most people are going to do the right thing. We're going to be fair, do the best we can, make sure there's an inclusion with everyone. And I believe most people will. But on the other hand, there are those who just going to do just what they want to do.
And some states are also adding voter ID requirements.
It's just another attempt to roll back the clock to keep from as many people voting as would, and to discourage people from voting.
I'm not a happy camper about all this. I'm old, I'm tired. But then all of a sudden, bang, they had all these voter ID laws, and I just read those and I thought, this is too much, I can't put up with this. So I went down there and I had a little sign that said I got arrested with Dr. King for protesting racist voter suppression, and here we are again.
What we're dealing with now is economics, and it's unemployment, and we have not done the groundwork to deal with poverty that we had done to deal with political and social rights.
I walked with Dr. King 50 years ago.
So the Center of Hope really was a way of giving people some reason for being hopeful here in Selma.
For more than 3 decades, the Catholic Edmundite Mission in Selma has been feeding the poor.
For the most part, we are serving about 1,000 every single day. The water tower says, Selma, a nice place to live. It is a nice place to live. It would also be wonderful if it said, Selma, a nice place to work. Jobs are key. Education is key.
Those who marched at Selma have experienced the benefits of their bold actions a half-century ago. And perhaps, more than anyone, they believe their struggle has not ended.
I wouldn't be true to myself if I say we have not progressed. we've come a long, long way. We just had so far to go that we're still not there. I think what the communities have to realize that things that hurt me today hurt people who don't look like me, who are not of my hue, that poor people of any color in the rainbow are affected by bad laws.
It wasn't in vain because it did a lot for me. If I had not been a part of the margin, if I didn't learn discipline, if I did not learn how to turn these cheeks, I would not have been able to be a fire chief, to go and break the racial barrier.
There's been a lot of bloodshed, lives lost, sacrifices made, and it was not the aim of the people who were involved in participating in these sacrificial acts, but it was for their children and their children's children. It was for coming generations.
I'll never forget the commitment that so many people had, not only me, but others who had a commitment to make sure that they would change the things that had transpired in the past, and now they want to be a part of making sure that things would be better.
We've got to remember this stuff. We've got to pass it on. It's not like we can duplicate it. Dr. King's not coming back. The Selma movement's not coming back. But this is part of our heritage. You learn from it, and you figure out how to revive it and recreate it now.
We're much closer to redeeming the soul of America and creating a more perfect union.
Thank you all for viewing the documentary with us. I'm going to hand the program over to Arnie Alpert to introduce our panelists.
Great. Thanks, Olivia, and thanks everybody for joining us this evening, and thank you to Open Democracy and all of the co-sponsoring groups for bringing us together. Olivia, how many people have we got here, do we think?
110.
110. That's fabulous. I want to just say that Ed Taylor was going to be the moderator this evening, but he had a family emergency came up, so I got the call from Olivia late this afternoon, and it's actually an honor for me. I was planning on coming, but it's definitely an honor. And then when I find out who all the panelists were, that made it even better. So I want to just introduce the panelists and say a little bit about what's going to happen. We've got three great speakers today. We have the Honorable Harvey Key. Harvey was born in Birmingham, Alabama, and was a young man during the period of time which is shown in this film here. So later on, Harvey moved to New Hampshire. He had a career in business. He also served several terms in the New Hampshire legislature and was part of the team that helped us bring Martin Luther King Day over the top to victory in 1999. So I'm very glad to be here with Harvey Key. Peter Kelman lives in North Berwick, Maine. He went down to Selma in 1965 as a representative of the Committee for Nonviolent Action, and since then he has continued to be involved in work for civil rights and as well as involvement in anti-war activities, the No Nukes movement, and especially in the labor movement, and has done a lot of thinking and speaking about how all of these different things fit together. So Peter Kelman, thank you for being here this evening. And our third panelist is the Honorable Melanie Levaik, who is a former New Hampshire state rep and state senator. Recently, up until January, she was the chair of the Election Law Committee in the New Hampshire State Senate and was really the #1 champion of not just defending voting rights, but expanding voting rights in New Hampshire. So thank you very much, Melanie, for being with us. I thought we'd probably start with Harvey to talk a little bit about what it was like in Alabama in the 1960s. Then we'll turn to Peter to talk about Selma and the march from Selma to Montgomery and the work that you did afterward on voter registration in Alabama. And then I'm going to ask Melanie to jump forward 57 years or so into the moment that we are in now, where we are not, while we're still trying to expand voting rights, we are having to fight a defensive battle to hold on to rights that we thought had been won 57 years ago. All right, does that sound good? Please keep yourself muted. If you have questions, put them in the chat. And after a while, we'll turn it over to Olivia to bring forward some of the questions for our panelists. So why don't we start with the Honorable Harvey Key. Harvey, unmute yourself and come onto the screen.
I think I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you so much, Arnie, I'm honored to be part of this panel. And I will always be honored to be a part of trying to right the wrongs in our society that have been going on since the beginning of this country. And I have a little voice, but sometimes it rings big bells. I'm not sure. But I was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1932, and that was during the Depression time, which meant that we were very, very poor. We lived on a railroad track in the worst part of Birmingham, Alabama, near the steel mills and the cement plants and lumber plants. I went to school at Lewis School. It was all colored Negroes at that time, and still is, I guess, if it's still there, maybe not. I went to Parker High School and then to Immaculata High School. Now, this Birmingham, you know and you read, everything is strictly segregated. And someone says if you're brown, you can stick around. If you're white, if you're black, you get back. If you're light, you can stick around. And brown, you can stick around. But if you're white, okay. But black, no. There were signs everywhere that says colored drinking water, drinking fountains. You couldn't go to a movie. You know the story. I'm going to repeat it to you. Everything was strictly segregated. You couldn't sit on a bus with white people. And if you crossed the line, you would be in big trouble. I tried to shine shoes on the corner to make money. And the police said, if you're here when I get back, you're going to get your whipped. I had to get off the street. You couldn't be on the street after 8 o'clock. More than 2 or 3 or 4 people together would be dispersed. Now, my mother cared enough about me to put me, which I thought in prison, in a 12-foot fence near the railroad so I couldn't get out and go hang around on the streets. So that's where I lived and played for almost 17 years. Finally got to a Catholic high school. In the Catholic high school, there were white nuns, no colored nuns, no Negro nuns. And the Catholic school was integrated. And I won a scholarship to college with the highest grades in biology and chemistry. So I didn't get it. The beating and what have you was not prevalent when I was a little boy. If it were, I could not see it because my mother kept me away from it. However, in North Birmingham on 29th Avenue and 30th Street, I saw a policeman shoot a colored man in the back of the head because they thought he stole some jewelry. Many of them went over to see this guy on the ground. And of course, we left right away because Bull Connor and his people would be coming over. And one occasion before, when I was young, we had an invitation to go to Lake, it wasn't Lake Superior, it was number 7 Lake, where they had hung a colored man. And that, to me, frightened me to death. The thing is, what they were doing is trying to frighten you so they could conquer you, in my opinion, later on. Early on, I just didn't come in contact with that kind of violence because my mother and a few ministers and a job as a shoe shine boy kept me busy. So I left Birmingham on a colored train going to North Carolina, won a scholarship to Johnson C. Smith University up at Charlotte. And of course, we sat in a colored coach, and I had what is traditionally known as a lunch in a shoebox. I think I had a couple of bologna sandwiches and a banana, and boy, was it good. So I got to North Carolina, and that was the first time I had seen in a place where there were signs that says colored and white. So I matriculated in at Johnson C. Smith for 4 years, was exempted from the Army. Then after I got out of school, I was drafted to the Korean conflict. Went to Germany on my way to Korea, got back and had seen so many different countries. I traveled maybe 5, 6, 7 different countries while I was there. And I saw a new world. And that world was not colored and white. It seemed to be all together. And it was warm and comfortable and invitational. Got back to Birmingham, and myself said to self, why don't you go down and vote? Well, I went down to vote, and the registrar who was there at the courthouse said, if you want to vote, you got to count the number of beads in this jar. And having just come back from the Army and feeling that I was tough as nails, I told him I would break his neck. And he said, I will shoot you and nothing will be done about it. Well, having been in the Army, I know what bullets will do. I turned around and walked away. That was my stint in Birmingham. And then, of course, I got mad about the thing. I couldn't eat in the front of restaurants. I had to go in the back where garbage cans and Coke bottles were to get a sandwich and then eat it back there. I put out a little pamphlet called Inside of Birmingham. And I didn't think that took a lot of courage. I just telling restaurants, they were called greasy spoons, to not eat in the back doors of white restaurants. And finally, my mother and several other people suggested that I leave town because George Wallace, Bull Connor, and the Ku Klux Klan was looking for me.
Harvey, what year was that?
That was 1956 or 7. I got out of the Army in 56.
Okay.
And
so
that
late
had to be
50s we're talking.
57.
Okay.
57. And the signs obviously were still up. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do the other. But I'd come back home and I'd seen the world almost. And I wasn't ready to accept that. So I took their advice and I drove to Cleveland, Ohio at night because they said they were looking for me. And my new life started.
Wow. Well, Harvey, that is an impressive story. Now, Birmingham was known as Bombingham, as really a center of extreme violence committed against Black people and Black churches. Did you experience that or observe that?
Yeah. The fella who was his name was Arthur Shores. He was an attorney for the NAACP. They bombed his house once a month. Every month, his house would blow up in smoke. And again, that was when I had just gotten back. And I was a member of the NAACP. I was a member of anything that said, we just got to change this. This is not right. And I mean, you don't have to be smart to know that's not right. What I'd recognize that they never ever stopped white folks from voting. They never tried to stop white people from voting. It was only colored folks and Negroes and beating them like they're pigs to not vote. And the voting means something. It has a lot of value, but we didn't know that. I didn't know that at that time. So I came north.
All right. Well, good. Well, thank you, Harvey, for the story. I want to turn it over to Peter because, of course, one of the things that we saw a little bit in the film we just saw is that there was an active movement to expand voting rights or gain voting rights in Dallas County, in Selma, during this period of time of the early 60s leading up to the March in 65. Now, the film, unless I missed it, didn't even talk about the actual march that happened from Selma to Montgomery. But Peter, you were part of that. So tell us a little bit about how you found yourself in Selma, a little bit about the march, and a little bit about what happened afterward in terms of the movement to win the right to vote.
I'm sure, and thanks for inviting me. I did want to draw people's attention to the New Hampshire connection to Selma, and that is that one of the people in the movie, Ms. Webb, who you might remember, she talked about on Bloody Sunday running away, and Hosea Williams picked her up, and she told him to put her down because she could run faster than he could. She later went on to write a book with a friend of hers, a close friend, Rachel West, called Selma, Lord Selma, which was made into a Disney movie. The reason I bring this up is because Rachel West was one of 11 children, and they lived in a house right behind Brown's Chapel Church. And a lot of civil rights workers stayed there, including 2 from New Hampshire. Peg Doby, who used to be the executive director of NARAL New Hampshire and has since passed. And the other was Jonathan Daniels, who was a seminary student from Keene, who was murdered as part of the movement in Lowndes County that summer. And they both stayed with the Wests. And I knew those kids. I wasn't that much older than them. And to me, they were always the best, most active part of the movement. And a lot of my memories of, being in demonstrations with them and being around those kids, they were just amazing. My own story was I was living in Voluntown, Connecticut in early 1965. And after Reverend Reed was murdered in Selma, initially a call went after Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered in Marion. James Bevel, who was an SDLC organizer, I believe, came up with the idea about a march from Selma to Montgomery. And they put out a call to mainly faith-based communities to send people down, one of whom was a Reverend Reed from Boston, who went down, and he was murdered on a sidewalk in Selma. And after that, another call went out for people to come down. And that's when CNVA, the New England Committee for Nonviolent Action, sent me down, and they gave me money for a bus. And I headed down. It was pretty uneventful until I crossed the Mason-Dixon line. And it turned out, at the time, one of the changes you see in our society is at that time, everybody in any position except for a cleaner that worked in the bus stations were white. And I was tracked without question all the way down. Slightly harassed, nothing too bad considering everything that was going on, but they knew where I was going and they followed me. And I don't think too many people took the bus down. Most of them flew or took chartered buses or cars. I got into Selma, I got into the bus station, and I didn't know how to get to Brown's Chapel Church. I'd never been there before, and it wasn't like we had the internet. There was no map that I could just look up on my phone. So the first African-American I saw, I said, how do I get to Brown's Chapel Church? And that's where I got my first bit of education about segregation and also how to survive as a freedom fighter in the Deep South. And the person told me, gave me directions, but he told me the streets to walk on where I was least likely to run into any white people. So that was my first, 5 minutes in Selma. And I got to the church, and by that time there was an injunction against marching. And so they had what they called the Berlin Wall, because once you got into the black neighborhood around the church, the projects, you couldn't leave in more than 3 people. And that's when I got involved in my first demonstrations. They were mostly the kids. And it's one of my best demonstrations I'd ever been in was the first demonstrations there. What would happen is you'd leave the church, usually be a couple hundred people, maybe more, and you'd walk toward the Berlin Wall, and all the time people would be singing. And one of the songs was, we got us the Berlin Wall, we got us the Berlin Wall right here in Selma, Alabama. And you'd come to the authorities, the sheriffs and the police and the state troopers, and you couldn't go any further. They'd block the way. And so the plan was that when that happened, the demonstration would be divided in 2. Half would stay at the Berlin Wall. The other half would head in the other direction, try to find another way out of the projects. What they were attempting to do was to get to the courthouse where there had been all these massive demonstrations to register people to vote. And then when they stopped us at the other end of the street, everybody broke up again. So now there were 4 demonstrations heading for the exits, kind of. We never made it out, but it was kind of exciting, and I never forgot that. And recently, when I was asked to speak to some grade school in Portland, rather than just talk, I recreated the demonstration with the students, and we had students walking all over the school, chanting and singing and breaking up and going in different directions. Anyways, when I get to Brown's Chapel Church the first time, behind the church, in the back of the church, was a place where you could sign up, find a place to stay, and get food. And I was assigned to live with some people in the neighborhood on St. Philip Street. And I'd go back to the church every day. And then when it came time to start the big march, the one that went through, I was asked to head up a crew of 50 seminarians and some Hollywood guy. And our job was to put up and take down the tents every day as the people marched from Selma to Montgomery. There were only about 200 people that actually marched the whole way. The bigger, because there was no way they could really handle a lot of people. And so that's what I would do every morning. I would get up and we get on a open bed truck and head to the campsite, take things down, pack them up and head to the next campsite. Give you some idea of what it was like. We often didn't know where the campsite was going to be for the next night. Like, we'd leave Selma in the morning and they haven't found a place for people to camp. It was very hard to find campsites. Most of the land was owned by whites, and the few that were owned by African Americans, a lot of them were pretty scared. And so, but we did. It was very muddy. It was wet. People didn't dress the way they did today. We didn't have that kind of stuff. A lot of people just wore plastic bags for the rain. Footwear wasn't great. The campsites, we often put down hay because it was so muddy, and people just slept on the ground on plastic and then headed out in the morning. One of my memories was that although there were all these federal troops there that lined the highways as the march proceeded, initially they all faced into the marches. Mm-hmm. Like, that's not where the problem was going to come from. And I think after 2 or 3 days, someone gave the order that they need to look in the other direction, not watch us. We would get to a campsite in the morning. The first thing we would do was line up and walk through the area to check for bombs with our bodies. After we did, then the Army would come through with their Geiger counters or whatever. Anyways, we finally get to Montgomery, and I was a peacekeeper on the march. And I was at the back of the march, and I actually never got to hear the speech. Or at least I couldn't hear from where I was. I have no memory of the speech. That night, we went back to Selma, and my job was to hang out outside of the church, not Brown's Chapel. There was another church in the projects, where there was a committee that was looking after the rides to bring people back from Montgomery to Selma. And that's when I found out that Viola LaRusso was murdered. And the way I found out was I was standing guard outside of the church, so-called nonviolent guard at the time. And I saw this young African-American in the street who looked kind of lost. And so I went over to him, and I don't know what time it was probably after midnight. And it turned out that he was the person, Leroy Moulton, that was with Viola LaRusso. And he was in shock, and he was just kind of standing there, looked lost. And when I got close to him, I could see that he had dry blood all over him. And so I brought him downstairs. I went back outside. And that's when I learned about the FBI's involvement in a lot of these murders. Because a short time afterwards, the detective from the Selma Police Department came up to me and asked me if I'd seen this guy. Of course, I hadn't. And of course, he didn't believe me. And he pushed me out of the way and went downstairs. I followed him downstairs. People down there knew what to do. And when he asked for this guy, everybody said, even though the guy was standing right there, nobody knew him, right? And he was asked, the detective, why are you looking for this guy? And he said, well, I don't know, except that the FBI asked us. And it turned out the reason the FBI was looking for him was because there was an FBI informant in the car that murdered Viola LaRusso. So, that was obviously a great lesson to me. Anyways, afterwards, I got to work with, there were a number of us that decided to stay after the march, and we participated in the demonstrations that continued at the courthouse, which was the first time and only time in my life I've ever been cattle prodded, and that's no fun. But the demonstrations continued for a while, and one of the details were that you would go in and you wait in line. You might get a chance to go in to register or to sign up to register. If you did get to do that, you then had to come back out, and on the next registration day, you had to be outside when they'd call you.
Mhm.
Hopefully you get called. Then you could go in and try to register. Of course, they wouldn't register you, but that was the process. And there were always hundreds and hundreds of people waiting outside, trying to draw attention to this until the Voting Rights Act was passed and they put in federal registrars. Anyways, I stayed in Selma, and Chuck Fager, who you saw in the movie, was assigned to work with a handful of us that decided to stay. And me and two friends decided to put together a freedom library in Selma, which is what we worked on for quite a while. We went and traveled and got books from colleges around the country. We built this big library. The library in Selma was segregated, and then there were demonstrations there, and what they decided to do was to take all the chairs out so nobody could sit in the library. So we built our own library and then had a summer school, a freedom school in the summer.
Wow, Peter, this is a great
Sorry.
stories of resistance
Taking too long, I know.
and creativity. So I'm glad to hear this, and I know there's a lot more to say, but I want to move on to Melanie, but we will have an opportunity for folks. If you're going to have questions for Harvey or Peter or Melanie, you can type them into the chat, and then Olivia will help us field them in a little bit. So hopefully we'll get to hear more of your story in a few minutes, Peter, because I know there is a lot more to say. So hang on there, and let me bring in the Honorable Melanie Levaik. As I mentioned, Melanie was the chair of the Election Law Committee in the New Hampshire Senate and a real champion now. So Melanie, I wonder if you want to maybe even just begin with a reflection of your own on what you take from the struggle in Selma and the struggle for voting rights so many years ago and where we're at now. So come on in, Melanie Levaik.
Thank you very much.
Melanie, I can't hear you. I'm not sure what the issue is.
Okay, got it. Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Arnie, and thank you, Olivia, and Open Democracy and our sponsors. I really want to thank Peter because I just wanted to put my hands on my screen and touch you because you were one of the people that marched and fought and knew those that died for us and for this effort. And always, I have so much admiration for the Honorable Harvey Key, who gave me stories to share in my election law hearings. So you asked about comparing Selma to today. And I have to say that I feel like we're repeating ourselves. Sometimes it feels like not a lot has changed. And sometimes it feels like we've made great strides. So I was only 7 when all of this happened. I was not aware. I was in New Hampshire. My parents, Rupel and Betty Perkins, they were impacted by this because of redlining and being denied housing. But I never knew that growing up. But, circle back to here we are today. As a chair of election law, several of the things that I tried to work on was modernizing our voting through automated voter registration, online registration, on independent redistricting committees and commissions, and also helping the college students vote. And we've had that right, but constantly that is being challenged. So, we had a good year in 2018 through 2020. We were able to accomplish a lot, but much of it stopped because we have a Republican governor. Now we have a Republican House, Senate, and governor. And after an election that we had the highest turnout during an epidemic, we now have 250 bills throughout the country that are meant to suppress votes. In New Hampshire, I know many of you are aware of the bills that are out there, but we have bills that are trying to make absentee ballots more cumbersome. Senate Bill 54 requires submitting a signature or picture ID when you're requesting an absentee ballot, and that's a challenge for disabled people and for others. There's a bill, HB 86, that eliminates same-day registration. There are quite a few bills, and we'll hear them tomorrow, that are focused on suppressing the vote for college students relative to the college or university, what type of ID you have, defining domicile, defining what temporary means. And then redistricting. We are already in a gerrymandered state, and it will get worse. We have, this is a redistricting year. The Republicans are in control of redistricting. On Tuesday, we'll hear the beginning of some of the redistricting conversations. But that is going to be an issue that we all need to be aware of and be a part of. I applaud Senator Perkins Quokka, who sponsored SB 90, which is going to help to guarantee that the process is open and transparent. Also, many of you may be aware that Open Democracy has the warrant article initiative on drawing fair districts, and our town is one of those towns that are included. And I think that this is really very important, because one of our tools is communicating, is letting our constituents and the people of our towns understand exactly what is happening and what happens through gerrymandering and not drawing fair districts. There was a woman on the video that talked about the impact of suppressing the voting rights, what it was having on not just Black people, but poor people of all colors. And when we talk about gerrymandering, what we need to understand is that voting rights doesn't just impact minorities. It impacts the working mother. Many working mothers were impacted due to COVID. But when you talk about childcare and who and how we get childcare, it impacts parents who send their children to public schools that were funded and because of vouchers may not be funded. It impacts our climate and how we address climate change and every policy that we have. So whether you're Black or white, old or young, rich or poor, this impacts you. So, I was thinking about our voting rights from 1965 to 2021, and it makes me think that our voting rights are very fragile. They are precious, they are tenuous, they are constantly being challenged. And we need to have remedies. Part of that is the communication, everybody understanding that we have to be part of this democracy. But also nationally, in Washington, we have HR 1, the For the People Act, which is going to be critical and impact us in a way that will promote more democracy, automated voter registration, allowing for no excuse absentee ballots, taking dark money out of politics. This is really important. And the House passed HR 1, and we need the Senate to pass their version, which is SR 1. That is going to be critical to our democracy, and also reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I do hope that we can pass these bills and that we can all go to Selma and celebrate and walk across the bridge.
It's bridge.
Yes, together.
Great. Yes, I certainly do. Now, I don't know, Melanie, whether you or any of our other panelists have had the chance to review it yet, but President Biden today released an executive order with at least some progress toward expanding or protecting voting rights. So if anybody knows about that, maybe we can come to that. But before we get there, I'm curious, Melanie, if you happen to know whether our New Hampshire congressional delegation have signed on yet as co-sponsors of HR 1 and SR 1, or if they've expressed opinions about it.
Well, the New Hampshire,
I mean, like Annie Custer
Annie
and Chris
Custer,
Pappas, Jane Shaheen, and Maggie Hassan, are they on board with this, or do they need to be hearing from us?
I know that Pappas and Custer voted for it already, so it did pass the House. So this is really good. I believe, well, we need to communicate. I sent letters to both Senator Hassan and Senator Shaheen. This is one of the most important things that they will do. And yes, I think we all need to send letters, including to Joe Manchin. But
Very good. Well, we're all West Virginians now. All right, that's great. I like that.
Yeah.
Good. And maybe, and just I guess we all know that we can count on open democracy to keep us posted on not only on the state legislation, but also on what's going on at the federal level. So everybody who's on the call here today, when you get those emails from Olivia, do what she tells you to. All right. Anyway, good. Thanks. Thank you very much, Melanie.
Thank you.
Olivia, do we have any questions yet in the chat that you want to bring up?
Yep. Jeff Dickler has a question. How much of the current voter suppression movement can be attributed to systemic racism, and sort of tying some of the themes of the movie to economic issues?
Yeah. I'm going to throw that to Harvey first, and then I'll see if others want to address that.
Say that again. What is the question?
Harvey, the question is how much we're seeing all this voter suppression going on all over the country. How do you see that as being tied to systemic racism, or is it coming from somewhere else?
No, I see it as tied to white supremacy. White supremacy is controlling. It's called frightening you, taking advantage of you while you're scared, and controlling everything you do. And right now, that's where the voters, that's where it is. White supremacy, I want to call it what is someone who's recently in our memory call it make America right, or keep America right, and keep America, what they really
Make America white again, yeah.
That's what I want to say. Make America white again. And when America is white again, everything else in America is under their control. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do the other, or you'll be jailed, hung, or lynched. And that's where that is going, in my opinion. I have one thing to say about maybe a remedy, and I haven't thought about this much. Everybody in this country who's 21 or 25 years old can vote if they show their citizenship and their age. Not any other conditions, but if you're 21 or 25 or whatever the statute might say, you can vote and you don't need anything else. If that could be put forth in the House or wherever it might be. But that's a thought in my mind that you won't have to go to this white thing, but to make it white again is what the voters, previous administration was trying to do.
Good. Peter or Melanie, I'm curious if either of you want to say anything about sort of where this current wave of voter suppression efforts is coming from.
I'd be happy to. Many years ago, I was waiting for a meeting at the New Hampshire Supreme Court, and I decided to look up some of the laws of the first year. Two struck me at the time. One was the one that set the property tax on slaves. And it was dependent on age. And that's how there was a property tax. And to me, it's about race, but it's probably overridingly about class. And that's the history of this country. It's based on property rights. The big part of our Constitution is about the liberty to own and control property. And elections are about who has the power, the common people or the wealthy people. At the time of the revolution, less than 10% of the people could vote, and those were people with property. And the other thing was that the higher the office you attained to, the more property you had to own. Now, mass movements have certainly dug into a lot of those things in terms of voting, but it's one thing to vote, and that's a big struggle. But the other thing is, what about the money? What about property? You know, we have freedom of speech, and that tends to mean the freedom to own the press, to buy the ads, which is not something that common people get to do, no matter what their color. The other thing about, if you look at Reconstruction, it was very important to understand what happened and why the bourbon class fought so hard to bring back Jim Crow. It was because white and black workers started to work together, vote together, form alliances, and they elected people, black and white, to the local legislators and to Congress, especially to the Populist Party. The answer to that was the first people that were lynched to break Reconstruction were white people. It was the white allies of the blacks that were first lynched because the message had to be sent that there's no way there was going to be cooperation between whites and blacks. So when you cross the colored line, that's when the danger took place. And those are the first people. Then lynching is used to keep African Americans suppressed, obviously, over the years. Anyways, to me, it's as much about property and about class as it is about race. Race is definitely involved. I'm not trying to say that it isn't. Anyways, that's it.
I want to bring it back to Melanie in a second, but if we go back and listen to or read the speech that Dr. King gave that Peter wasn't able to hear because he was at the back of the crowd in Montgomery, that was part of what Dr. King was actually talking about at the Capitol building in Montgomery. So go back and read that speech. It's an impressive one. Melanie, I'm just curious from your perspective when you were there in election law, how did you assess the efforts to try to keep people from voting? Like, what was that about? And do we need to understand that in order to push it back in the other direction?
Well, I think that our legislators sometimes look at this like winning and losing, not about principle, not about what is right for the people. And that is part of what happens with gerrymandering. You know, we're drawing lines, and do we draw the lines to fit the people or the politicians? And to win, if you have to win and draw the lines to fit the politician, then you're not serving the people. So we have a real problem here. Peter and Harvey were, you know, they made good points, and I think gerrymandering is the tool that is used to carry this out.
That's certainly one of them. Good. Olivia, what else have we got in the chat there for questions, or do you have any questions yourself that you would like to bring up?
There's a question from Vinny, wondering if there's a connection between voting rights and civil rights groups in Selma, Alabama, compared to what's happening now with Amazon workers.
So I guess the point is that Amazon workers in Alabama are right now engaged in a union organizing drive. So that maybe brings back to some of the things that Peter was talking about. Peter, are you following that particular unionization effort?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of parallels between what happened in 1936 in this country and what's going on presently. And that is that Franklin Roosevelt ran for a second term, and he ran against the economic royalists and the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court had found all New Deal legislation unconstitutional. That's followed by the sit-ins in Flint, Michigan, and eventually 400,000 people took the property of their owners and held it in strikes, at which point the US Supreme Court reversed itself on all the New Deal legislation and found it constitutional. What we see going on today is we have gerrymandering again as it affects the Supreme Court. That's been really clear. And so that if something makes it through our legislatures, it's probably going to get stomped in the Supreme Court again. But the other thing is that the whole atmosphere that's going on with unions today is historically true, been going on for a long time in this country. When it breaks like it did in 1936, was when the CIO, the unions, formed alliances with Roosevelt, elected New Deal governors, and that enabled the New Deal to really take hold. Prior to that, we had really nothing. There was no real net to protect people. And I think today it's the same situation. It's not until I think finally workers finally get together and start organizing in spite of all this opposition, then in fact you're going to see really big change. One other comment on that was that in looking back on what happened with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, it occurred to me that in order for it to pass, you had to get the votes of people and the people in Congress from places like Michigan, for example, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. People who were elected to office back then owed their election in large part to unions. And that made it impossible for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act to pass. Those coalitions don't exist right now in any great way. Unions are very weak. And unless unions like those that are trying to organize in Alabama actually make some real gains, it's not likely that we're going to see some massive changes that really affect our economics and how our citizens actually live.
Great, thanks, Peter. It was interesting in the film, the way they talked about the connection between poverty and racism, or poverty and the right to vote. I thought that was significant. Olivia, I think there was another question about redistricting.
There is, but there's one from Bev Cotton about, given our current state legislature in terms of election law, what is the most productive action for citizens to take?
Well, let's throw that to Harvey first and then to Melanie.
Wow. I'm not there now, but historically, I think one of the problems is naming it what it is. Racism is perhaps all over the country. White supremacy is held by some people who control others. The person who's sitting next to Ernie could be a racist. You wouldn't know it. But if the person sitting next to Ernie could stop him from going to a water fountain or stop him from riding a bus, that's white supremacy. So I don't think we're hitting the nail on the head with that. And I can't do anything except appreciate Mr. Kelman about historic knowledge and bringing me up to date. But I think the language that we use will keep us separated for the next 200 years. Black and white in our society is not what we were born with. I know I've said this so many times. I was born as a human being who lives in America. I was not born as black and white. Not being a historian, not knowing a lot about this stuff, that's a social construct. And it's designed to make slavery more essential. And if we don't believe that, we'll be having these conversations a huge number of years in the future, and the situation will be the same. I think we have to come down with an axe. You call white supremacy what it is. It's not racism. I don't know the definition actually for all of that, but the two are not the same. And I don't know if I answered your question, Ernie. What did you?
Well, you always. It's an ongoing discussion there, Harvey, as we know, as you've said. We're not going to solve all this tonight, but we're making some progress. Melanie, the question was really was also about.
It never ends.
Go ahead.
Harvey or Melanie? I'm finished. Thanks.
All right, good. Melanie, the question was, what do you think is the most effective that we as citizens and activists can be doing in order to have some impact on our legislature?
Well, thank you for the question. It's a great one. And there's one thing, and that is to communicate. We can communicate to Concord. We've never had a better opportunity to be able to listen in and to give our feedback on how we feel about a bill. Writing to our representatives, writing to the governor, because the governor is very sensitive about what, when he gets a lot of people that are in opposition, it shines a light on him. but we also need to communicate in our communities to our friends and to our neighbors. We need to find like-minded people, and also people that are not necessarily like-minded but reasonable, that will listen. We've got to keep the conversation going, build our numbers, let people understand what is happening. Work together, just like they did in Selma, working together to solve this problem.
Good. Thanks, Melanie. Olivia, I think we have time for perhaps one more question?
Sure. One more question around the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. HR 4 is another piece of legislation moving. And knowing what we knew from 56 years ago, remembering today is Bloody Sunday, what is the best way to get a democracy that works for all of us?
Can I take that one? To be part of it.
Go for it.
Be part of it. Like Granny D said, democracy is not something we have, it's something we do.
And in your case, one of that was you decided to run for office.
And
go figure, you got elected to the House and then you got elected to the Senate. So
yeah, be involved.
That's good. Others? Peter, Harvey?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we agree that we live in a participatory society. You got to participate. You got to, as Melanie and Peter says, and all of us are saying,
Let's see, I can't hear you now, Harvey. Are you still speaking?
Oh, we lost him.
I think that was it for me.
That was it. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Peter Kelman, some final words here on.
The old saying goes, keep on keeping on.
Uh-huh.
I'll end with that.
All right, that is a good place to be. Brian Beal from Open Democracy, do you want to come in and talk a little bit about the agenda going forward here?
Thank you, Arnie. I appreciate that. I'm Brian Beal, Deputy Director to Olivia, and I help to coordinate the Open Democracy teams around the state. We have 6 Open Democracy teams that work writing letters to our legislators, just as Senator Levaik was telling you. We contact the governor. We work with the Secretary of State's office. I'm going to share my screen, and we've got 3 actions for you. They are simple but powerful actions. The teams do these things every week, but we're only asking for 1 set of those from you. And if you want to take it further and join a team and participate, we'd love to have your help. But we've created a page that you can get to right from the registration page that you signed up for this event on. And our action number 1 is to oppose these voter suppression bills that are going to be heard in the legislature tomorrow. Now, there are a lot of them, and you can see that we've got them all outlined. If you want to read about the bill, you see our positions on those bills, and you can weigh in on those. And you can go log in at this URL here. And the state has, as Senator Levaik said, has been making it easier for people to participate in the process. You can log in, and I've given you some instructions on how to do that once you get in there, and how to log in your opposition to these bills. That's action number 1. Action number 2 is to write a postal mail thank you note, just a regular old thank you note to Annie Custer and Chris Pappas. They were both co-sponsors and both voted for HR 1 last Wednesday night in a 220 to 210 victory out of the House. And we want to thank them. But as was mentioned a few minutes ago, HR 4 is coming shortly, later on this summer or possibly early this fall. And we want to make sure that Representative Custer and Pappas are not only supporting these bills, but are champions for these for HR 4. And what HR 4 is going to do is restore the Voting Rights Act that was repealed in 2013. You heard that referenced during the movie. We have given you their addresses there to send your thank you notes to, and getting a postal letter these days is I wouldn't say unusual for our congressional delegation, but it makes an impact when you take the time to write a postal letter. And then number 3 is we're going to write a letter to our senators, Senator Maggie Hassan and Senator Jeanne Shaheen, and we are going to ask them to support S1, which is the Senate's version of HR 1, as well as HR 4. So write them a letter. And what I've done is I've given you the outline of S1 and HR 1 and all the things it does. It's the most significant piece of democracy reform legislation in our lifetimes. It is a huge bill of 700 plus, almost 800 pages. We've given you the cheat sheet there to quickly write a letter to them. And again, this makes a big difference when they receive these letters. So if you could take a few minutes to do that, you don't have to brave walking across the bridge and being beaten by state troopers. You can do this from the safety of your own home and have a real impact.
That's great.
Thanks everybody for being here tonight.
Great. Brian, I have 2 quick questions for you. Do you advise a postcard rather than a letter that goes in an envelope?
We do both, depends, but I'm asking you for a letter this time.
Okay, because I know that for a while there was a whole anthrax thing and letters weren't getting through, but postcards might have been easier, but maybe that has changed by now. My other question, Brian, is does Open Democracy get its funding for programs like this from big checks from corporations?
We have a variety of sources of income, but we get a lot of our support right from the people who are out there doing the work and supporting what we do on an everyday basis, trying to work the legislation and to educate the public and helping people to vote.
Great. So that then, so another letter people could be, or another place people could sign their name would be on a check to Open Democracy and put that in an envelope. Or I imagine there's an easy way to donate online from your website. So that's good to know. All right. Well, very good. Well, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, Doreen, for making this happen. And special thanks to Melanie Levaik, Harvey Key, and Peter Kelman for being great panelists and helping move this discussion forward. We're 57 years from Bloody Sunday. We know what is the march we need to be on right now, and that's toward expanding voting rights. And that means we've got to beat back these voter suppression efforts and continue to try to realize the promise of democracy for everybody. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.